Hello, good evening and welcome everybody. It's so nice of you to join us to this very special event to celebrate a new anthology of seminal writing on the theme of doing by the Do Books Company, alongside 10 years of publishing its inspirational pocket guides in association with the Do Lectures. My name's Emma. You might have seen me before doing some of these events. I own a bookshop in Crickhowell called Bookish, which is in Mid Wales, and we're soon to be opening a second bookshop in Abergavenny. We've been stocking the Do books since they started out back in 2013, and I've been an avid fan of what they've done ever since. So I'm absolutely delighted to be hosting this evening's event. So just a little bit of housekeeping on what is going to happen this evening. We will be hosting this event for approximately an hour, and this will feature talks from two best-selling Do Books authors, Robert Poynton, who wrote Do Pause and Do Improvise, and Bobette Buster, who wrote Do Story and Do Listen. Here we'll celebrate the Do spirit of independence. If you're at the helm of an independent and small but powerful community business, you will need a pencil and pen, a pencil and paper even, as our speakers share storytelling, well-being and self-development tools that you will want to jot down. You will have an opportunity to ask questions at the end, so please do have a think. There's a chat button at the bottom of your screens that you can enter any questions in, and I'm going to put them to Rob and Bobette at the end. So please do get your thinking caps on. It'd be lovely to hear from you. Now, I just wanted to give you a little bit of a potted history about Do Books. Now, Miranda West, who's the founder and publishing of Do Book Company, came across the Do Lectures back in 2011 after watching a talk about the future of print in a digital world, and after discussing a plan to publish books by the incredible list of speakers with Do Lecture founders Claire and David Hyatt. The Do Book Company was launched in the spring of 2013 with 5 books: Do Grow, Do Birth, Do Story, Do Improvise, and Do Disrupt. Their concise guidebooks are written by leading experts who have spoken at the Do Lectures, which is an annual event held in West Wales. With talks shared online to a global audience, the idea behind the Do Lectures is a simple one: that people who do things can inspire the rest of us to go on and do amazing things too. The company aim is to recreate that same positive change in book form, whether that's the mastery of a new skill or craft, such as baking bread or taking a great photograph, a simple mind shift in how we approach our working day, or a shot of inspiration to help you get started or work smarter. Each book is fairly short, about 100 pages or 20,000 words, as it focuses on the doing rather than the background theory. They can be carried around in your back pocket, dipped in and out of. Excellent gifts. So now, 10 years on, 2023, the collection reaches 40 books, which is quite staggering and can be found in bookstores around the world in different languages, in print, in audiobook and ebook formats. Now, with thanks to the simple but impactful cover art by James Victor, who really did get the brief by distilling the basic notion that ideas change things. These really are books to inspire action. So in recognition of their 10-year anniversary, Do Books have published the Book of Do, which is what I hold in my hand, fresh off the printing press. Do Books have published this. I think they're celebrating their 10th anniversary next Thursday. And this is really a manual for living. Within these pages, you'll find 50 photographs, 30 illustrations, 8 lists, 6 recipes, and 4 diary entries. It is an absolutely beautiful book. And hundreds of ideas around business, creativity, resilience, and well-being that might just change your life. Now, after receiving an early reading copy, I have been grudgingly sharing it with my husband, and I can certainly vouch for its ability to make you think about simple things from another angle. Plus, I must make the gin on page 280. It sounds amazing. I'm just going to put that down for a minute before I drop it. Now, on to the main event. I am just going to bring the lovely Rob Poynton to the screen. So bear with me 1 second. So we've got Bobette as well. we'll come to Bobette later. It's me and Rob now. So hi, Rob.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us. I'm just going to do a very brief introduction, if I may, with you, looking very smiley in the background, and then I'll let you get on with your talk, which I'm really looking forward to. So if you don't know, which I'm sure you do, Rob is the author of Do Pause, which I have here. You Are Not a To-Do List, which it really resonates with me, and Do Improvise, which I think was your first book with the Do Company. As well as write, Rob designs and facilitates workshops and retreats, many of them for business leaders. Much of his work is based on applying ideas from improvisational theatre to everyday life. And he divides his time between an off-grid house in rural Spain, which sounds amazing, and Oxford, where you are joining us this evening, where he's an associate fellow at the Syed Business School. In 2020, in a bout of invention prompted by the pandemic, didn't we all have that? I didn't found two new online ventures though, which are Yellow Learning and the Everyday Improviser. Thank you so much for joining us, Rob. I'm going to give you the floor, and off you go.
Thanks very much, Emma. Yeah, I'm going to talk about both books this evening, which is not something I've done before. Do Improvise, I'll start with that. It is both my original Do book, but also my recent, because I rewrote it last year, and I'll come to that in a few minutes. So I have a kind of 10-year take through the lens of Do Improvise on the history of Do books. I should say that my background is not in the theatre at all. I think Miranda was a bit nervous when we first published Do Improvise, thinking it'd all be about theatrical kind of lovey kind of stuff. And that's not been my way into it at all. I got very interested in improv theatre a long time ago because of what it can help any of us to do, to deal with change and uncertainty and ambiguity. And so the work I've been doing draws from improv theatre and is very playful. And those ideas in the book draw on that experience. But I'm not interested actually in the theatre, not particularly. And the work is not specific to the theatre. And I think the kind of basic idea is that actually we're all improvising all the time. So if you think about it, none of you have a script, not for your day-to-day. If you did, you wake up in the morning and lean over and pick up a dog-eared script. I mean, it's not something we do. And so the capacity to improvise is something which in places like the theatre or in music, jazz in particular, people have developed a particular craft of improvisation. And what that means is they've, in the case of the theatre, identified some language and some ideas that can be tools and useful practices for the rest of us, because we are all improvising the whole time. We don't control what's going on around us, either in the micro. We don't control what we're going to think next or what we're going to say sometimes. We certainly don't control people around us, be they our offspring or our employees or our customers or our bosses for that matter. And so we're always dealing with kind of unpredictable and uncertain circumstances. And what the practice of improvisation offers us is some very simple ideas that are quite easy to understand, you can learn them quite quickly, and you can kind of use them forever. So one of the joys of this work for me is I'm still using the basic ideas kind of 25 years on, and that's because 25 years from when I first came across them. And that's because it is a practice, and I think that's kind of the first point. So in many ways, the ideas in this book are quite unremarkable, but I think that's an advantage. They're very simple, straightforward ideas that you take and use. So you do them and you keep doing them. So it's a kind of eminently practical approach. So I'm not going to go in great detail, but this is from the new edition. We lovely diagram done by Nick Parker. And so this little Venn diagram, in a way, it's kind of all here. And so the first piece of practice, the first thing that you can take and do is to do with your attention, is to do with noticing, to notice more, or to ask yourself, perhaps, what else could I notice? Our senses aren't scientific instruments which just pick up everything that comes at us, whether we know it or not. We're selecting from information the whole time, and we're choosing what we give our attention to. And so you can choose to pay attention to your inner complaints, or you can choose to pay attention to someone else's mood around you. And you can practice and play around with what you're noticing and notice more things. And when you do that, all of a sudden things that you can take and use get thrown into sharp relief. I'll go through all of them and I'll explain how they fit together. This leads us on to letting go. Letting go is the one perhaps that most people struggle with, because it sounds like abandoning things or giving up, but it doesn't really mean that. It just means not trying to cling on to everything the whole time. So, you know, I'm writing a new book at the moment, which will come to you later. And while I'm writing, I just need to let go of all the other things I do have to do and just focus on that. And if I can't do that, I'll be distracted and unfocused. And then the last one is to use everything. I think it shows a little bit that I wrote this before social media was really quite the thing it is now. And so sometimes people say, how can I possibly use everything? I don't want everything coming at me. But I guess the idea is anything, use anything. Things that we categorize normally or think of as errors or mistakes or shortcomings in improv language, which is useful to all of us, I think, can be what we call offers. And so you can take them and use them. So these are 3 practices, really the way to use this. And the thing I'd encourage you to do is to just go around your everyday life asking, well, what could, particularly if you're stuck or struggling, what could I let go of? What else could I notice? What might I use that I'm not currently thinking of as a resource? So you might use a failing or a shortcoming or a breakdown in an imaginative and different way. So that's the kind of practice. As I say, it's simple and quick to learn, and you can use it forever. And sometimes you forget, and never mind, you can pick it up and try again. And that happens to me all the time. One last thing on Do Improvise before I move on. I said I rewrote it. I rewrote it last year, so after the pandemic, and it was really interesting doing that. And I think that I detected a slight change in the tone that I was adopting. I'm not sure I did it consciously, but when I first wrote it, I think improvisation was seen to be a bit crazy, a bit strange. What are you doing? Talking about the theatre, and how's that relevant to everyday life? I think after the pandemic and all that involved and all that unfolded from that, I think it's a much shorter, quicker route to people to understand that everything is really beyond our control, or there's very little that we can be certain about. And so this set of practices, and there's many more in the book, but these are the basic ones, can enable you to develop a capacity to respond. That's really the point. So that dealing with uncertainty and complexity and ambiguity and all the myriad things that come at us isn't really a question of being perfectly prepared. That's what we're led to believe by our education system sometimes. But actually you can't. There are always going to be things you can't anticipate. And so alongside that, not to supplant or replace it, but alongside that, this offers you some, as I say, very simple ideas that you can take in order to develop the capacity to flex and adapt. So I'll come back to that briefly at the end, but I want to talk about Do Pause a bit as well. And 2020 was quite a big year for me because we published Do Pause in 2019. And so it was relatively new. And Miranda got in touch and said, you know, this is your time. And of course, I was completely stuck like everybody else. But it did become known as the Great Pause. And it was very interesting for me to look at the effect of that. The basic idea in Pause is a really simple one, actually. It's the idea that managing all the pressures and stresses that we all have coming at us it's not very fruitful or helpful to think of work-life balance. I work here in Oxford at the Side Business School on leadership programs, and I can't count the number of people, hundreds of them literally, from senior positions, from cultures and businesses all over the world, all saying, yeah, no, my work-life balance it's not really working. You know, I can never get it right and I feel stressed. And so when that many people say that, it got me thinking, well, maybe this is just the wrong idea. And so the idea in my book is actually, instead of trying to get some kind of delicate and precarious balance going on, just think about, for you, in your circumstances, in your life, in your work, at whatever stage you're at, where and how can you introduce some pauses? And the lovely thing about pause is the pause could just be a few seconds. You know, I could stop now and just collect my thoughts, and that's a pause. And sometimes a very short pause can be really useful. And sometimes a much longer one. So here in the university, they've institutionalized this. They call it the sabbatical year, but it's not only the preserve of academics. So the New York designer Stefan Sagmeister closes his business down every 7 years, takes a whole year off. And he says that's not just about rest and recuperation. That's actually the source of the new ideas that give life to his design business when he comes back. And so this idea of pausing is that I can't tell you when or how you should pause or what kind of pause, but the book explores different kinds of pauses for different purposes with different durations and different tools and ideas and labels and practices that you can use around establishing different kind of pauses. And the invitation really is to kind of design your own relationship with pauses, to try things out and see how it goes. And if it works, do more of it. And if it doesn't, drop it and try something else. So you can see there's a bit of the improv creeping in here. Now, one thing I really want to mention is the subtitle for Do Pause, which I absolutely love. And I can say that because although it's in the text, it wasn't me that picked it out. It was David Hyatt at the Do Lectures, actually. And it causes a lot of comment. So the subtitle is, "You are not a to-do list." And very often people will say to me, "Oh, I love my lists and I love my to-do list. I couldn't possibly do without them." To which I will always reply, "Me too." Because the idea that's captured so beautifully there in that subtitle is not that you shouldn't have a list. It's the idea that you are not a list, and certainly not a list of things to do, that you as a human being in all your fullness and richness and complexity and all the wondrous relationships and imagination that you have are far more than a list of tasks to be ticked off. So it's quite interesting how people assume that I'm kind of against lists, and of course I have lots of them. But just as there's many ideas, many suggestions, many different kinds of pause that you'll find in the book. But just to play around with the list idea and to give you a couple of different kinds of lists. One that I absolutely love is the today list. So rather than the to-do list, you write yourself a today list. And the practice here is you write it kind of the night before or the morning of the day in question. And there's a discipline here. So once you write your today list, you have to be practical. So you can't write finish book. You're not going to get that done in days. You have to write what you think is reasonably achievable that day. And here's the secret: is once you've done it, once you've done them all, you're not allowed to put anything else on it. You're not allowed to say, "Oh, I'll just get ahead with tomorrow's work." So there's a sense of kind of completion and creating some spaciousness. So there's that one. The other one I think is quite fun as well, which is to write yourself a not to do list. That's you can be quite kind of mischievous and playful with that, because it sounds ludicrous, but I often find myself worrying about things I know I'm not going to do, but my mind and my attention will go there, and that will kind of fill up my space. So by capturing those and writing them down, you can kind of, oh yeah, I'll put those to one side. Maybe I'll do them one day, but I'm not doing them now. So there's a couple of different kinds of lists there that you can play with. A couple of other examples of things from the book. My favorite one is, it's a bit silly, but there's a very serious point, which is count to 1 before you enter the room, or count to 1 when you're stressed. 10 is way too far for some people, but who can say they don't have time to count to 1? And the serious point there is that if you can just stop yourself enough to be able to count to 1, you've already had that micro pause. And if you do that, say, before you enter a room, or before you reply to somebody when you're feeling kind of stressed and emotional, perhaps, or before you make a decision, or before you click send, the counting to 1 just creates that tiny little interregnum. And one of the beauties about pauses is that they kind of have a disproportionate effect given how long or short they are. It doesn't really work in a linear way. One last one is, because I'm here in Oxford, it's in my mind. So there's someone I'd worked with here who runs the university, or at that time ran the university's technology transfer company. And it's quite a high pressured job, quite long hours. And what he would do is every evening before he left his office, he would shut the door. He was lucky enough to have an office, so he could do that. But he shut the door, and he would, as he said to me, he would take 5. And that was a kind of reference to the Dave Brubeck track. And actually, the version of it I have is 5 minutes and 8 seconds long. So if you feel like it and you want to follow this practice, you could just put the song on. So what he did, he put the song on and he would set aside those 5 minutes while listening to the music for no particular purpose. And of course, his mind would wander. Sometimes it's true he would think of things to do the next day, but that wasn't his purpose. Sometimes his mind would just wander. Sometimes he'd just get in touch with how he was actually feeling. And his purpose in doing it was to create a tiny transitional liminal space before leaving the office and returning home. So 5 minutes is longer than counting to one, but these things can be really quite effective in very short bursts. So the invitation really in the book is to start playing around with and composing your own set of pauses. And actually, I think the opportunity there is really to shift your relationship with time and to feel that you can be in charge of it rather than it be in charge of you. So the last thought I wanted to share is to do with something that ties the two books together. I was partway through writing Do Pause before I realized that actually it's on the cover of the other one, because look, it's here. There we go. Let's push more pause. And I don't think the Rangers realized either. So it's a lovely kind of post hoc thing to see that there were patterns in my thinking that meant that this idea was there to be explored. But I wish I could claim the credit for having thought of it, but I didn't even realize. And the other was that in the model I spoke about, this is a lovely thing you get from readers. So I had a letter, an email from a reader who, in the middle, I put in a piece of practice called Everything's an Offer. But she said, actually, you need to put pause in the middle, or you could put pause in the middle, because in the improv world, where things actually feel faster than they are, and where improvisation really benefits from a sense of pause, it kind of works both ways. You need the pause in order to be able to apply a piece of practice, but also once you apply a piece of practice, it helps you into a pause. So the two kind of feed each other. So it's kind of sweet when people add to your work, which is a spirit of improv as well. I kind of yes and from one of my readers. So I think that's enough from me. I'm going to hand back to Emma, and thank you very much for your attention. And it's a joy to have been part of Do Books for this 10 years. And hopefully we'll come to this later, but I've got a new one, so it's not done yet, but we'll talk about that later. Emma, I can't hear you. I don't know if everyone else can, but there
we go.
Yeah,
it's a plague upon the Zoom community. You're on mute. What I was saying is, thank you so much, Rob. I am sure that everybody like me will want to pick up the first two books, and I know that there is a third coming, which is Do Conversation. Do you know when that is going to be?
Yeah, next spring, I think, but it'll be out by as long as I meet my deadline.
Fantastic. Oh, thank you so much. I am going to ask Bobette to start her video now, and we will rejoin you for some questions later on. There she is. So we'll see you in a little while. If you could just shut your video down, please, Rob. Perfect. Hi, Bobette. Thank you for joining us. I know you've been waiting patiently in the back listening to what Rob has to say. So just to introduce Bobette to our audience, who is joining us from whereabouts in the States are you?
Hollywood, California.
Yeah, see, Hollywood, California. So Bobette is the author of Do Story, which I have here. How to tell your story so the world listens, and do listen, understand what's really being said, and find new ways forwards. She's also the writer-producer of the feature documentary Making Waves, The Art of Cinematic Sound, which is now playing on PBS in the US, and it's also streaming. She's writing her third book based on her 25 years of experience as a Hollywood creative executive and professor of storytelling. Her TEDx lecture, The Radical Art of Storytelling, with over 700,000 views, is available on YouTube. Bobette is currently serving on the visiting faculty of Tufts University Graduate Engineering School, teaching the power of science and storytelling. And she also serves on the guest faculty at Pixar, Disney Animation, Amazon Game Studios, and many film or business programs worldwide. She's also been named as American Film Scholar Cultural American film scholar, cultural diplomat by the US State Department, lecturing in Ukraine, Uganda, and among other countries. So, wow, what an introduction, what a CV. It's really a great thrill to have you here with us. I'm going to hand you over now for your 15-minute slot, so I'm going to disappear. But over to you, Bobette.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm always sort of overwhelmed that I would be invited to speak about storytelling to the land of all the great storytellers that hail from Great Britain. And I find it a great honor. And I was very touched when the Do Lectures asked me to speak in 2012, I think it was. And then Miranda West asked me to distill this for the book Do Story, which came out in 2013. And it's been a great relationship since then. I couldn't help but think how much what I have to say about storytelling and listening, it, segues beautifully into what Rob was saying about improv and pausing. It was J.K. Rowling who said, you don't have a story unless people are willing to listen. And I didn't realize it, but I grew up in the very last days of the American small town environment in which the currency of neighborliness was telling a story on yourself. And if anyone arrived at the door, everything stopped, a piece of pie was offered, a cup of coffee, and the stories began. And initially they were just funny stories about something that happened that day or recently. And then they would segue, there would be a pause and segue, and people would start to build on each other's stories, and it would become very labyrinthian and beautiful as people would say, that reminds me of the time. And then people would start to reflect on what happened during the war. This is my grandparents' generation, or the Depression, or those years. And it would create a context and a neighborliness of understanding life's events. Now, I read a study sometime later that children, this was from Emory University in Georgia, children who have heard the stories of their elders who have gone through difficult times actually develop a resilience, because you think, if they did that, I can do it too. Well, that's different than just watching the stories that are broadcast through our screens. That is the person, that is the living memory that is so important. So what I started to do with Do Story was to try to distill, this was the mandate, into doable actions, a whole series of things that each one of us can do to tell our own story. And one thing I noticed, now I came to Hollywood and people immediately said, you seem to have a knack for this. I'm like, really? Because to me, it was the air I breathed. It's the world I was like a fish in water with storytelling. But what I noticed both in Hollywood, and then as I adapted my ideas, I was asked to adapt them for corporations or nonprofits, is that everyone has a story to tell. And most people say, well, I have nothing to say, that, everyone has a more interesting life. But if you pause, people want to tell their story. I think it was G.K. Chesterton who said, perhaps it's apocryphal, that never underestimate the 5-minute conversation with a 16-year-old. I think that's great advice overall, because what you're doing as you engage someone and listening to them, you're creating a space for them to reveal and to be heard. There's a quote I have in my book, and Do Listen, from David Augsburg, who says, being heard is the closest thing to feeling loved. And one thing I've noticed with regards to listening is that people will say they have two emotions about listening. They'll either say, that person went on and on and on, they made me listen. Or they will say with astonishment, they really listened. And so what I think we're in danger of with our screen age and with our screenagers is the idea that we can create a common ground of listening to each other in the day-to-day. One thing I've noticed is the best way to tell stories or to capture stories in your day-to-day life is when you're in movement. When you're, say, picking up your kids from school or in the back seat of a car and somebody's talking in the front seat. You're not necessarily face to face. Maybe you're cooking or gardening, but something about the shared space creates an emptiness of time to reflect in the moment. And that, I think, is essential to our humanity. Now, the number one thing that everyone is talking about here in Hollywood, because we're in the middle of a major writer's strike, and that's going to go into other issues for months to come, is of course ChatGPT, or artificial intelligence. And there's a great fear that we all have. We don't know. It's an alien force that has finally descended on planet Earth. What is this going to mean to our storytelling? What is the truth? What can we trust? There's with the strike placards that everyone's seeing, there are now some wonderful memes on social media. One woman wrote, "ChatGPT does not have childhood trauma." I thought was very witty. But I think the truth of that is, it is only in creating a moment with people that you actually discover their humanity and their vulnerability, and that we create a campfire experience. And I think that we are hardwired to be storytellers. Most people say, well, I am no storyteller, but I've never seen it to fail that you can be taught to tell a story. In fact, I think this is the only way we learn and grow in our humanity, is from listening to other people's stories. So I want to say that in my experience of teaching storytelling, I have a few points that I often bring up. People say, well, I'm no storyteller, there's nothing special. And then I'll just say, well, tell us something about yourself that we wouldn't otherwise know. And usually these stories are pretty, harmless, not very important. But normally by the third person, or by just sitting and saying, tell me more, people want to talk. They want to tell you something that's on their mind, something they've held in. I've never seen it to fail. And what I've also noticed is that there's an element to storytelling where if you create the atmosphere of I'm listening, you're creating an atmosphere of trust. I'm your friend. Now, what is it to be a friend? I heard once that what is a friend is really sort of something we sort of bandy about. We can have good acquaintances, neighbors, colleagues, but a true friend is someone to whom you can tell your worst news. And they're not going to say, oh, that reminds me of what happened to me years ago, or that's not so bad, I heard something happen to someone else. They're going to listen. They're going to hold the space for you. They're going to say, tell me more, or how did that feel, or simply, I'm sorry for you. But the sign of a true friend is also, can you tell them good news? And will they rejoice with you? Will they laugh? Will they hold the space? As you take that moment in the sun, at that moment, you can share vulnerably with someone. That is the power of storytelling. That is the campfire experience in which we grow as human beings, in which we sort of nurture each other, in which our days are better for having spent a few minutes with someone, even 5 minutes. One of the elements of storytelling that I always tell people is set the GPS, which is to say the place, the time, the era. Just say when it happened, where, how old you were. I remember when I was 5 years old, I was, blah, blah, blah. Or I remember where I was, when September 11th or some great tragedy happened. This helps anchor everyone when they're listening to your story. The other thing is what I call the gleaming detail. This is actually a term the Irish have for storytelling, but a gleaming detail is in that one image. How do you tell the story effectively? Poets do this all the time. Whether you're reading Mary Oliver or Seamus Heaney or John Betjeman, they take one idea, one image, one sound, and they extrapolate it. And you suddenly, what is ordinary becomes extraordinary, and you have a new perspective on the world. I'm thinking about the film E.T., which I mention in my book, great classic film. But filmmakers will often find one image that's the gleaming detail, which they rhyme. You shouldn't do it more than 3 or 4 times throughout the story. And if you've seen the film E.T., little Elliot, 10 years old, encounters an alien in his backyard, as you do. And the next day he gets on his bicycle and he rides up into the forests and looks for this little alien. There's a trail of candy. Now, we don't think anything about it because a bicycle is ordinary to a 10-year-old. It's what they do. Later on, we see that Eliot puts E.T., who in fact enters his life and lives in his closet, onto this bicycle basket. And they go into the forest where E.T. plans to create a phone so that he can phone home to his people. Spoiler alert, if you haven't seen the film, you should. It's a great classic. And so that's charming that he is a little boy, resourceful, helping out his friend E.T. But then at the end, Eliot, who's been much maligned by the 15-year-old boys, the friends of his brother, they dismiss him. He decides to capture E.T. before the US government takes E.T. away and makes him like a frog specimen. And so all the boys align in their bicycles and they put E.T. on the front basket, and it's the teenagers and Eliot against the adults in their cars, and they are out with the adults, and it's a wonderful chase scene. And you think, oh my goodness, aren't they clever? Until they hit a roadblock, and they're surrounded by adults. And in the original version, one of the adults holds up a gun, which Spielberg eventually excised from the film. And so all seems to be lost. And at that moment, Eliot thinks it's all over, and E.T. causes all the bicycles to fly across the setting sun and the moon to the bald spot in the forest. It's one of the most magical moments in cinema history. And when the film premiered at Cannes, all the people, the women in their fine gowns and the men in their bow ties and tuxes, they apparently opened up their Cartier lighters and lit them and started stamping their feet. They were roaring with the magic of that moment. Now, that is an ordinary detail that became extraordinary. The other thing I want to say is, when people tell a story, what I think is really interesting, and Ralph Waldo Emerson said, if you're really listening, people tell you who they are within 3 to 5 sentences. They tell you what's on their mind. They can't help it. And I've always noticed that people also reference sense memories. Now, you'd think most of us are visual in our sense memory, and most of us are, but I've never seen it to fail that if some people are auditory in their sense memories, some people talk about the textures or the taste. I remember a young girl from Russia talking about the day they realized September 11th had happened. This is in Russia, 8-9 hours ahead of New York City, which the event happened early in the morning, and it was a lot, and they were all by the lake, sitting out, lazy summer day in September. They had an old transistor radio on playing, Soviet rock music or whatever. And she said, suddenly the sound in the radio became strident and urgent, and it seemed to resonate off the waters of the lake. And they all gathered as one. And suddenly they heard that the United States had been invaded by 4 passenger lines that had airlines filled with passengers as an act of terrorism. And she said, it was as if all of our summers were now gone. This is a young girl in Russia listening to the radio. And what I'm listening to when people tell stories are these little gleaming details, these sense memories. They take you into the moment, the living memory moment. And that, I think, is what is so essential to us in this day and age, is how do we break through the silo of all this social media aggression? Certainly here in the United States, we are a nation divided now. I think the only way we crack through is by remembering that each one of us carries the fire of our own story. We each have something to say. Each of us have a way of looking at the world that deserves to be heard. And I think that as humanity began around the campfire, I mean, that's how we progressed. Somebody dared to leave the tribe, go over the hill and sit around a campfire of another tribe and say, you know what, over that hill, there's some berries. And if you want to go 2 hills over, you'll find some great game. They told stories, they shared information, and we as human beings grew in understanding of each other. So when I'm in the mode of listening to people in the day-to-day life, I never I never take it for granted that if you just take that 5 minutes and pause, to quote Rob, your life will be enriched. It simply will be. You will see the world differently. You will notice something differently. You will maybe laugh at something. It will be an opening to get outside of yourself, which I think is the essence of storytelling. So I hope this is a gateway through how I see the world and how I hope all of us will take time to enjoy each other all the more as we go forward.
Thank you, Bobette. That, again, certainly did give us pause. And I know Robert is going to. Robert was joining us. He's disappeared.
Oh.
There you are. You're back in the room. Thank you so, so much. That was really extraordinary. It's been really wonderful to hear from you. I'm going to give the audience a little bit of time. I can see we've got one question, but I'm going to let them just percolate on what they've just heard and give a bit of time to add questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. But I was really interested in the fact that, some of these ideas are really quite complex, and you have to distill them down into, quite a small set number of words. We're talking about 20,000 words, 100 pages. I just wondered what your process in doing that. If I go to Rob first.
Yeah, very different in the two books, actually, in the sense that with the improv book, I'd been doing the work for 20 years already. And I'd written a longer book about improv. So it was a kind of, that famous quote often attributed to Oscar Wilde, Churchill, whoever, writing the short letter after the long one. So in that case, I think what I chose to do was to kind of give everybody everything up front and then unpack it. So you kind of all of the model, which I labored over in the previous book, goes into the first chapter. I don't build it up. I just go, here it is. And then kind of unpack it. With Dupause, it was very different. I felt like a student. In fact, there was one talk I gave, which Miranda introduced me as an expert, and I kind of bridled because I didn't feel like one, and I'm not sure it's a subject one can be expert in. I felt myself to be a student, to be very curious. So that was a very different process, and I think, I was kind of like on a journey and inviting people to accompany me. So I think the two books for me were very different.
Absolutely. And there's learning in the process as well. And I'm sure, again, you learned something again of your craft within the process. How about you, Bobette?
Well, I really appreciated the discipline. I have to say Miranda West is, I always call her the Spitfire General, man. I thought it was really helpful to the doing mandate, which is what is actionable from these ideas? How do I take this to the next level? And in the United States, we have this assigned reading every student has to buy, this little book called Strunk and White, Elements of Grammar. And it's a highly readable, funny little book by this great American writer, E.B. White. He also wrote some children's books, Stuart Little and Charlotte's Web. Anyway, but it's all about grammar and the elements of style and how you make your writing readable and better. And everyone has a pocket version of that. And so I thought, wow, this is a way to distill these ideas down into a pocket version that anyone can take with them. And so working on the outline with Miranda, I suddenly had an insight as to, if I only had this much time with anybody, what would I say are the essentials? And since then, I have been corporations and nonprofits and PhDs and people writing eulogies have reached out to me from all over the world to say the book was essential to how they could get into their topic. And I really see this as because of the due mandate, what's actionable from these ideas.
Absolutely. And the books are really designed to inspire action and positive change. But we talked about something that's pretty small here, let's say 100 pages. Do you think that something as small as a book or a book this small can really change someone's life? Go back to Rob.
I don't think so. I know so, actually. I think I think of books as kind of like radioactive markers that go out into the world, you know, and a lot of the time you don't hear what people do with your books or your ideas, but every now and then you do. And there's one story comes to mind of a friend of mine who lives not far from Bobette, actually. And we were just chatting, and he said, "Oh yeah, no, I was talking to Steve the other day, you know, that lawyer whose marriage your book saved." And I was like, "What?" And he said, "Oh no, I told you about that." And I said, "No, you didn't. I promise you I would remember." And of course, that was a little bit of a strong claim, but it turned out that certainly his marriage had been in a difficult period. He was inspired, this was Do Improvise, to use it, if you like, to kind of reframe how he was thinking about himself and his life. He actually started to go to improv classes. And then his wife noticed the change. She went along to improv classes as well, and they stayed married, you know. So that's just one specific concrete example where in this case, by something not happening, but their life was definitely changed. And there are a surprising number of those. I mean, and many of them I think that one never comes across, but even those I've heard is quite a few.
Yeah, it must make you feel great.
Yeah, I mean,
Well,
just one last thought, sorry about that, but the story I do pause with, the new edition of Do Improvise with is true, which is that there are several people that have had the model in the book tattooed on their skin. You know, so when people do that, you kind of go, okay, that, you know, that they must have found some value in it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Babette.
I think that ideas are electric, and they have their own radioactive uranium sort of force. Absolutely. And, you know, you think of all the small books in history, everything from Machiavelli's Prince to Mein Kampf to Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac, which is the absolute basis of the conservation movement around the world. These are tiny books with big ideas. And honestly, in today's world, where very few people in Gen X and millennials really read, to the level that the rest of us learn to adore, and we know how to sink in and immerse ourselves in a book. But now I fear that today's youth are missing that sort of gorgeous moment of submersion, you know, giving way. So you want to grab them by big ideas.
Absolutely. We've got a couple of questions in from the audience. One for Rob, one for Babette, and one for both of you. So I'll go to the question for Rob first. This is from Simon May, who I know. He says, "I'd love to pause, Rob, but I dare not. What is the trick here, please?" I think my answer to that is to head down to the bookshop tomorrow morning, Simon, and read Rob's book.
Yeah, I think this is a compelling thought, but it's an illusion, because you have to pause. If you don't, you'll burn out. So the question is how and when and what's appropriate for you. And the short answer to this, if you're feeling very stressed and it feels like it's impossible, is start ridiculously small. That's why the count to one thing, you know, between breaths, you know, actually there's a tiny pause. Sometimes you might take a pause of a breath, which is a few seconds, but actually if you want to go even smaller, there's a pause between the in-breath and the out-breath. So I think the first stage is to just become sensitized, just to be aware of and noticing where there are pauses already, and then just kind of amplify them a little bit. But you have to work with, you have to start where you are. As you know, Theodore Roosevelt said, you know, start where you are with what you've got, you know, and do what you can. It's a kind of pragmatic thing, and then just explore kind of what works and give up if it doesn't, and try something else and start small. But really, nobody in this world is too busy to pause for 3 seconds. It's just not true.
Absolutely. Babette, Rick Aaron is asking.
Can I just add on to that comment? If you look at the history of storytelling, which I do, if you don't pause, life will pause you. So it's in the post. And rather you be in charge of that. I think it's very worthwhile considering that. But that can be an accident, or something will come in harm's way because you are pushing too hard. And that's a fundamental truth in all storytelling. So just saying.
Yeah. Very true, very true. My mum always tells me, if you don't stop and do something, your body will do it for you soon.
Oh, it's there.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
we have a there's an epidemic of burnout, and it's not, it's predictable. It's a straightforward relationship, as you've both just said. So yeah.
Bobette, Rick asks, how can we take our everyday ordinary life and find the stories within it, rather than focusing only on the larger and extraordinary events and stories that happen in our lives?
Well, I think that is the lie of the age, that we're sort of in this wallpaper of, immersive storytellings, grand labyrinthian stories, whether it's Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter or Star Wars or all these fantasy adventures, when actual storytelling begins in the ordinary. That's where it begins. And to take delight in that, because all stories begin at the point of aha, and then change, reversal, surprise or shock. Going back to if you don't pause, you will be shocked. If you do pause, you might get surprised. And the point is, it's all around us. And some of the greatest stories ever told began in the most ordinary ways. And yes, you go on a journey, and some of those will take you on fantastic, unknown, thrilling experiences. And some of them are truly just a day in the life. What is Ulysses? A day in the life. So I think it's always important to, I reference in Do Story, I have a whole new resources page. If you listen to great music, the storytellers of our time, the singers, the rock stars, they're all referencing an emotional moment. They're trying to capture that feeling when this happened to me. And that is what you're actually doing when you're telling a story, is this I noticed. Wow, this caused me to change. That's all that storytelling is. Or it's a cautionary tale. I didn't change, and wow, this happened.
This is a bit of I suppose I can merge two questions together here. There's a question from Gareth and a question from Sharon. Gareth says, great point, Bobette. Plenty of adults I know find reading a whole book too difficult. What advice would you give to help them? And then Sharon asks, does a book need to be read? Does it lose power if it's listened to instead? So two-part question there.
Well, I'm a big believer in the power of reading and being read to. I think that's why it's essential. Einstein himself said, if you want your children to be intelligent, read them fairy tales. If you want them to be really intelligent, read them more fairy tales. And I think the essence there is the shared visual. We don't have enough imagination to lead our lives. We simply don't. We need other people's stories. And there's something about the parent-child experience. As you read, the child is cozy in your arms, feeling safe. They are beginning to imagine the world. They're being given a landscape by which, if I did that, could I do that? And so it's essential that we allow ourselves that experience of reading. Now, if you're not used to going in depth to reading, I say take a page at a time. Take smaller books, take different chunks. No, I'm in the world of movies and adaptations and television series, long form, limited series, etc. I personally think there are two different experiences, reading and visual. And it's very important to cultivate your own imagination and not the visual imagination of others. They're two different things. And anyway, about audible readings, personally, even though I've done 2 Audible books, I think it's better to read because you're in your own mind's eye. You're creating your own characters. To me, it's a more immersive experience. But if I'm busy driving long distances, there's certain kinds of books I'm happy to have read to me. So I think they're just different things. It's like different listening experiences to music or different sports experiences, there's certain grand sports events you don't want to miss. You want to be front and center. others you maybe don't mind listening to, you know.
Absolutely. I've always struggled to read nonfiction. I've always been a huge consumer of fiction books, but with the advent of audiobooks, that's changed. I now listen to nonfiction books, and sometimes I will then take them back home and read chunks of them. But that's really helped me in my reading habits, definitely. And as you say, it depends on what you're doing. If it is, and it's the same with ebooks. People come into the shop all the time and say, "Oh, well, you know, what do you think about ebooks? How do you feel as a bookseller?" And it's like, as long as people are reading, I don't mind. But some people will have an ebook to go on holiday or to commute. They'll have a book by the side of the bed, or they'll have an audiobook when they're cooking in the kitchen. So, you know, there's different books for different times of day for me. So I don't think there's any right or wrong way to consume ideas.
I think it's an embarrassment of riches we have now, and it's just to develop, cultivating what works for you as you're moving through life. I want to put in a plug for Benjamin McAvoy's course, Hardcore Literature, which is, he hasn't asked me to do this, he doesn't know me from that, but he's on Spotify, Patreon, YouTube, and he is Oxford educated, passionate purveyor of great literature, the importance of reading the big classics. But then he offers this context in his YouTube lectures, which you can watch for free, around the reading experience. So that is great for me, because then you're forced to read, you know, Tolstoy, which is, you know, a fair whack of your time. But then you get his breadth of experience, Oxford educated, and he takes you to documentaries and other things. To me, that's an extraordinarily rich experience we have today.
Absolutely. There's a large amount of snobbery sometimes about how we consume books, so it's really important to have these conversations. I've got a final question for you both, from Charles, who says, your books are fab, smiley face. What subject should Miranda have asked you to create a text around? In other words, what is your fascination that we don't know about? Plus, what title should Do Books publish next?
Well, I mean, I'm kind of in it. So Do Conversation is the next one for me. That was a fair time coming. I pitched Miranda Do Walk, and she had somebody far more qualified to do it than me. Already out there. So yeah, conversation, I think, which I see as very different from talk, and that's the distinction I'll make. That is the one that I'm kind of already doing. So if I was going to go a bit more fictional, I guess, you know, fiction, not novel, I mean, but what other subject? I think complexity, actually, the science of complexity fascinates me. In a way, improvisation is my take on complexity. But I think actually trying to make the complex science of complexity super simple in a do-sized book would be a real challenge. Yeah.
Absolutely. Babette, how about you? Left of field?
What other Do book I think should be written? Is that the question?
Yeah, well, it's more a case of what's your other passion in life, you know, because we all have lots of different passions, we have to choose them sometimes. What else would you write about?
Well, I am writing a third book right now. It's really about helping people to recognize that, you know, what is it to go on? For my own purposes, it's called The Story of Courage. What is it to develop your own courage? And most of us maybe have a sense of bravado or daring do. And we've heard a lot of the lore of the hero's journey. Are you on the hero's journey? And I think most of us don't care if we're heroes, and true heroes will say, I'm not a hero. And I think really the issue is recognizing the thresholds in your life in which you have to step through. And what is it to take courage? And I have seen countless amazing stories. Again, this goes back to the ordinary, where people have to walk through something. They have a great deal of fear into the unknown, and they change the world. And I'm fascinated with this fulcrum in life that each one of us faces, that very few people dare to go through. And that's what I'm really writing about.
Fabulous. Well, I think we've come to the end of our time together. A couple of comments in the chat saying thank you, and your books have moved to the top of quite a few people's to be read piles this evening. So thank you so much, Bobette. I know you've got a flight to catch shortly. And to Rob, it's been a pleasure talking to you both and meeting you both. I wanted to say thank you and congratulations to the Do Book Company. And thank you to bookshop.org who have brought us all together here this evening. Please do go out, buy some Do Books tomorrow, either on bookshop.org or pop into your local indie. It would be fantastic to see you. And hopefully at some point we will meet in person. So from me to you, have a wonderful evening and we'll see you soon. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.